Some people say stalking is when two people go for a long romantic walk together, but only one of them knows about it. In today's video, we're sharing real-life stories that take creepy to a whole new level. From a high school crush gone wrong to a mall encounter that just won't end. These are the kinds of experiences that stay with you for life. If you enjoyed the stories, please subscribe. When I was 19, I met this guy who worked at the subway near my job. At first, he seemed like a decent person, and he took me out on a date. Things started out pretty normal, and for the first week, everything was going well. But by the second week, things took a turn. He started asking me for money, which at first seemed innocent enough. Small amounts for a soda or gas, like $5 here and there. I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just in a tight spot. But then he began asking for much larger sums, like a few $100s, claiming he needed it to get by for the week. I didn't give him any money, which only seemed to frustrate him. On top of that, he started talking about us moving in together. Keep in mind, this was only 2 weeks into dating. It was moving way too fast, and I started to feel uneasy. Every time we went out, he would do something strange. He'd scream at the top of his lungs in public or sing nonsense loudly, drawing uncomfortable stares from people around us. Afterward, he'd laugh it off and say he was just having fun, but it was embarrassing and made me question what I'd gotten myself into. Even more concerning, my dog, who loved everyone, couldn't stand him. My dog would growl and try to bite him whenever he came near me, which was out of character for him. This was a dog that never showed aggression, but something about this guy set him off. By the end of that second week, I knew I had to end things. I didn't feel safe around him anymore. I broke up with him over the phone, which I normally wouldn't do, but given his unpredictable behavior, I didn't want to do it in person. As soon as I told him, he lost it. He completely flipped out, yelling at me and accusing me of ruining everything. That's when the stalking started. He began showing up at my workplace, so often that my manager eventually had to ban him from coming inside. My coworkers started walking me to my car at the end of each shift because they were worried about my safety. No matter where I went, he was there. Whether it was the grocery store, the gas station, or even just grabbing food. It was like he had some sixth sense about where I'd be at any given time. Soon after, I began receiving texts and strange emails from him. They ranged from obsessive to creepy, with phrases like, "We're meant to be," and "I can't live without you." I blocked him, but somehow he kept finding ways to contact me. One night, it escalated. I was home, and out of nowhere, he showed up at my house, demanding that I come outside. I refused and told him if he didn't leave, I would call the cops. That's when he started sobbing uncontrollably, almost to the point of hyperventilating. I was freaked out, but I stayed inside and locked all the doors. After that, I thought he'd finally get the message, but I was wrong. The next day, I was home alone, studying for my college courses. I heard some rustling at the front door, but assumed it was just the mailman, or maybe my dog messing around. However, my dog started barking and growling more aggressively than usual. Then the doorbell rang. Again, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a solicitor. But then, someone started messing with the door handle. My heart sank. I looked around for something to defend myself with, but all I had nearby was a broom. As soon as I heard the door start to open, I grabbed the broom and ran toward the bathroom, locking myself inside. My dog immediately went after the intruder, barking and trying to bite him. I screamed that I had called the police, even though I hadn't yet, hoping it would scare him off. Thankfully, it worked, and he took off running. I called my neighbor, a former military guy who lived across the street, and he came over to check things out. By the time he arrived, the guy was long gone, but my dog had some cuts and scrapes from the struggle. It was terrifying to realize how close I had come to something much worse. The next day, I filed for a restraining order, and my dad even called the guy's father to let him know what had happened. Although I continued to receive a few more emails from him, he never showed up at my house again. Eventually, he faded out of my life. Thankfully, I've since moved a few hours away and gotten married. But looking back, it's still frightening how quickly things escalated in such a short amount of time. This all happened over just a 3-week period, but it felt like a lifetime. This happened when I was young, more than 30 years ago. I was 21, had just moved to a new city, and got my first apartment. One day, I headed to the local mall to buy essentials and decorations. It was my first time there. I parked outside a department store and wandered through the mall, checking out the stores. While browsing through prints in a wall art shop, I looked up and noticed an older man, maybe in his 50s, pretending to look through the prints too. But he was actually watching me. When we made eye contact, he quickly looked away. I got a weird feeling and left the store. I walked down to CVS and soon noticed the man had followed me. To test it, I went to the feminine products aisle. Sure enough, he followed me there, pretending to browse. It was almost funny when he realized what aisle he was in and got flustered. But he kept sticking close to me throughout the store. When I went to check out, he made a beeline for the register too, but someone stepped in line behind me, which seemed to annoy him. I saw him rummaging through the candy bars, probably trying not to seem suspicious. At that point, my instincts were on high alert. I left the store and quickly ducked into the store next door, hiding behind a pillar. I peeked out and saw him run out of CVS, standing in front of the store, looking around, presumably for me. I went to the back of the store and told the employees about the man following me. I didn't think I needed security, I just wanted to lay low for a while, so they let me sit behind the register. I waited for about 30 minutes before heading out. I continued shopping for another hour or so and didn't see him again. Eventually, I went back to the department store, browsed a bit, and then left through the side entrance where I'd parked. As I stepped through the first set of doors, I checked behind me to see if anyone else was coming so I could hold the door. And who do I see right behind me? That same man. I quickly said, "Oh, I knew I forgot something," and went back into the store. I rushed to the nearest employee and told them what was happening, asking for mall security immediately. Security arrived, I explained the situation, and gave them a description of the man. They then escorted me to my car. I felt relieved. Once I was in the car with the doors locked, I unwrapped one of the cassette tapes I'd bought and popped it in. As I drove away, I saw the man again. He was walking in a quieter part of the parking lot with a short, heavy-set blonde woman wearing glasses. I took a different exit from the mall so he wouldn't see me. But that wasn't the end of it. About a year and a half later, I had quit my job at a doctor's office, traveled to Italy, started a new job at a department store, and then took another trip to France. This new mall I was working at was about 25 miles from the other one. One evening I was working at my counter when an older woman approached, browsing the products. She struck up a conversation about Paris, and I mentioned that I had recently visited both Paris and Italy. I told her how much I loved Europe and how I wished I could move there, but I would need to find a job first. She smiled and said, "Well, this might be your lucky day. The company I work for is hiring, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." I asked her what type of work it was, and she said it was in hospitality. When I asked for the company name, she replied, "I'm in a bit of a rush, but if you give me your number, I can call you with all the details." That's when I started shaking. Something about it didn't feel right, and my intuition was screaming at me. I looked at her more closely and realized she was the same woman I had seen walking with that man in the parking lot a year and a half ago. Thankfully, I had forgotten my name tag at home that day. I gave her a fake name and a fake number. I never saw her, or the man, again. I was once accused of stalking by a college classmate, and I was horrified. A professor I deeply respected and who I had been making a great impression on pulled me aside to discuss the matter. He told me I was being accused of improper behavior. I tried to explain myself, but he cut me off with a, "Just save it." Honestly, if I were in his shoes, I probably would have reacted the same way. When someone is accused of being a stalker, What they say doesn't seem believable. People are predisposed to assume the worst. The professor informed me that I would be removed from the class for the semester and that I needed to speak to the dean to determine whether I would be expelled entirely. I was in shock. I was an honor roll student, consistently on the dean's list and dependent on financial aid. If I were expelled, I'd lose everything, including my aid. I couldn't believe this was happening, but maybe it was what a stalker deserved. When I met with the dean, he immediately began explaining the process of my expulsion, clearly not interested in hearing my side of the story. I had to interrupt him, speaking over him in a moment of desperate rudeness, just to make my plea. I showed him the text messages that this girl, who I was supposedly stalking, had sent me. I had proof that she gave me her phone number, that she suggested we hang out outside of campus. I showed him the messages where she offered her home address and even suggested I pick her up. There were texts about us planning to attend a live show together, discussing where we might eat and how we could smoke on the way. Everything pointed to her willingly engaging with me. I showed the dean the full transcript of our conversation, which made it clear that she had no issues with me, until the night I went to her house. When I got there, she had a sprained ankle and couldn't go out. I told her it was no big deal, I wasn't upset, and I'd just go to the event on my own. It was a requirement for another class anyway, and since it was my birthday, I figured I'd make the best of it. Up until that point, all the texts indicated there was no problem between us. There was no hostility, no discomfort, just normal, friendly communication. But then, at our next class, she told the professor I had been stalking her. In the end, I wasn't expelled, but I wasn't allowed to return to that class either. Worse, the entire class still had the impression that I was some sort of creep or dangerous person. I had to withdraw from the class, which left a W on my transcript, and I still had to pay for it, despite not being able to complete it. The whole situation nearly ruined my life. It damaged my academic standing, my reputation, and my confidence. Even though I wasn't expelled, the emotional and financial toll was enormous. It's hard to move on from something like that, knowing how easily one false accusation can destroy everything you've worked for. In high school, I was the biggest nerd. Sat at the front of the class, got straight A's, the whole bit. I was very shy and had been bullied before, so I kept to myself as much as possible. The quarterback, this meathead steroid-using type of guy, was in a few of my classes. He sat at the desk behind mine, and I assumed it was because he wanted to cheat off me. I'll call him QB. At first, QB started talking to me in a friendly way, asking how I was, how my weekend went, etc. One day, he came into class, sat down as usual, but then tapped me on the shoulder and whispered, "I know where you live." I felt embarrassed because my family and I were living in a mobile home at the time. I laughed it off and said, "Yeah, right." But then he said, "You have pink carpet in your room." I froze. He went on to explain, in detail, how to get to my house. We lived out of the way, and the streets were only familiar to people who lived in the mobile home park. They weren't regular streets and weren't mapped. I decided to ignore him and hoped he was joking. As I walked around school or sat with friends, I'd often catch him staring at me with an "I'm going to kill you" look. He started mocking me in our classes and in the hallways. He'd try to rub my back in class. When I'd switch seats, he'd follow me. If there were no seats near me, he'd just sit and stare. One day, he sat behind me and said, "I could kill you so easily." I didn't tell my teachers or family because, after the previous bullying, I didn't believe anyone would help. I spent the last 2 years of high school doing my best to avoid him, always looking over my shoulder. During senior year, when we got our yearbooks, he stole mine. A couple of days later, he gave it back, but he had written all over it. He circled every picture of himself, football team, class photos, activities, everything. On his class picture page, he scribbled things like, "I know you liked me, but I would never be with someone like you. Now you can look at my pictures whenever you want. I will always know where you live." I showed my best friend, and she was scared for me. I tried using whiteout to cover the stuff he wrote. After high school, I moved hundreds of miles away for college. Later, I found out through some friends that he had been trying to find out where I went and what my address was. Luckily, no one gave him my information. I went on with my life, broke out of my shy girl shell, and started going out and having fun. After a while, I moved back to my hometown. Some friends and I decided to visit a random out-of-town bar, and he was there. I almost screamed. He noticed me and started making his way toward me. I quickly told my friends, who didn't know him, that this guy had stalked me in high school. QB came over, put his arm around my shoulder, and I froze. One of my friends said, "Why don't you leave her alone?" He looked at me, with his arm still around me, and said, "I have no idea who you are. I wouldn't go out with someone like you." My friend started yelling at him to leave me alone. The bouncers came over and kicked him out. We left soon after. I haven't seen him since. I've moved far away. Although, he did pop up as a person you may know on Facebook. When I was 16, I went on a blind date with a friend of a friend to a dance. He went to a different school, but we had talked on the phone a couple of times before the dance. This was before cell phones. And got along well. We ended up having fun at the dance. Afterward, we kept talking on the phone for a little while, but it became clear that he was really hung up on his ex-girlfriend. That made me lose interest. I stopped taking his calls around Christmas, but before that, he said something that scared me. He told me his ideal Christmas gift would be his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend dead under his Christmas tree. He said it seriously, and it freaked me out. Apparently, ignoring his calls was a mistake. He started sending increasingly insulting and upsetting messages through our mutual friend, who I stopped considering a friend after this. The worst part was that he knew where I worked in the mall. He would come by with his friends while I was stationed at the register and couldn't leave. They would stand just outside the store and yell all kinds of things at me. Strangely, none of my coworkers or managers seemed to notice or do anything about it. This went on for weeks. The final message he sent through our friend was a threat that he was going to assault me, though he didn't use that exact word. The friend thought this was funny. I was at my locker at the end of the school day when the message was delivered. I slammed the locker door right next to his face and snarled, "F you." It was the first time I'd ever said something like that with real anger behind it. He looked genuinely surprised and backed away. I don't know exactly what he said to the stalker after that, but somehow the harassment stopped. Even so, I was seriously on edge for a while. Every time I went to work or was alone away from home, I kept looking over my shoulder, worrying he might follow through on his last threat. I felt hunted. Luckily, nothing ever came of it, but I still regret not telling my parents or the school about what was happening. Have you ever had a similar experience? If you've got your own stories or thoughts, drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more stories like these. Your support helps us bring more of these spine-tingling tales to life. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.